Firstly, Carol and I go back to the days when you started in the Organic Federation of Australia, and before her time I was actually the chair of the Organic Federation of Australia, and I resigned that when I became president of IFOAM, which is the international body for the organic sector, and I was president for 6 years, and I stepped down last year at the AGM, and now I'm the international director of Regeneration International. We are actually registered in the United States. We're an organisation that promotes food, farming and land use systems that regenerate and stabilise climate systems. And I want to really, there's a lot of things that we do. I'll just talk, given the time, I'll just talk about two of them today: climate change and health of people. But, you know, for us, things like community, culture, local economies, democracy and peace are really important. So, you know, in terms of empowerment of communities and democracy, we believe co-ops are the way to go. Transparent co-ops. You know, we really want to see empowering of people where people can, you know, basically own our common goods and not allow a handful of people, you know, less than 1% control actually 99% of the world's wealth. This is wrong, and we need to take it back. And this is why I'm really pleased to be here. We're strong supporters of co-ops. We'll talk about this word regeneration because it really is taking off now, and it is far more than being sustainable. Unfortunately, the word sustainable has been overused. You know, Monsanto now was, before it's taken over by Bayer, the world's largest sustainable agriculture company. You know, is that what we mean by sustainable? Sustainable is actually defined as keeping the present system stable without degrading it or running it down. Is this what we want? No, we've got to improve it. And that's what regeneration is about. We need to do better. We need to improve. And so rather than sustain the status quo, which is going to be a disaster, we need to do a lot about it. So in terms of regenerative agriculture, we're using it as a large umbrella to bring in like-minded groups. You know, the days for us to argue who's better than who, we don't have the time for that fight. It's not a fight we need. We'd rather actually be inclusive, not exclusive. And so we're using it for heaps and heaps and heaps of agricultural systems. And for us, it's really working. We're an organisation that's 3 years old. We have over 140 partner organisations now in 40 countries, and that is growing. Every week we're getting more and more. But what I really want to talk about is, and one of our core, you know, priorities is dealing with climate change, because this is now an existential threat. You know, in 2016, we reached 400 parts per million CO2, which is, when we say the highest level in 800,000 years, that's looking at ice cores in both Antarctica and Greenland. That's as deep as we've gone. So we know that in 800,000 years, there is no record of 400 parts per million. Although there's other tools that they can use, and there are records back, you know, that go back millions of years. I'll talk a little bit about that. But what I want to talk about, actually, I shouldn't have said last year, I should actually say year before last now, it increased by 3.3 parts per million. So despite Paris, despite all the claims of who is doing what, the real, for us, the real measurement is a simple one. And this is how much carbon dioxide are we putting into the atmosphere? Is that rate going up or is it going down? Well, it increased by 75% the year after Paris, and it's increasing. So despite all the talk about renewables, things are getting dramatically worse. I think what's really important for me to get across here is this, is with carbon dioxide and what we have in the atmosphere now will stay in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. This is really important to get this across. Things, even if we stabilise, for some reason the world decided to go to renewables tomorrow and we stabilised it, things are only going to get far worse. And what I want people to understand this is we're already more than 1 degree hotter than the Industrial Revolution. To heat up this planet by 1 degree, and that includes the oceans and the atmosphere, is the equivalent of the energy of billions and billions and billions of nuclear bombs. I'm using this violent metaphor because I need you to understand that this energy is what actually fuels our weather systems and at times violently fuels it. So what we're seeing now is this increase in extreme events like droughts. We're in an unprecedented drought in Australia. It's actually, I can tell you, there's an unprecedented drought across the whole planet. The heat waves, storms that come, floods, because what is happening now is because essentially a really good word for this instead of climate change is climate disruption. It's actually a better word. The climate is completely disrupted because of this energy. It's pushing it out of whack. And it's going to be a long time before it forms what's called a new stasis. We had a stasis for, probably 1 million years or more. And our human activity now has disrupted it. And, now, it's completely out of whack. And as a result, when it rains at the wrong times. Those rains tend to be destructive and flooding. So for farmers, I'm a farmer, the days where we could predict our climate, predict our rainfall, are almost over, or pretty well over. And this is very serious. I was in Germany last week, and when I flew into Frankfurt, I looked down and I could actually see all these brown in the trees. I said, this is weird, this is middle of summer, and what I'm seeing looks like autumn. What's happening? How can autumn be coming on early? And I get there and I realise what's happened now. They're in an unprecedented drought and heat wave. Trees are dying. No one's ever seen this in Europe before, ever. The leaves are going brown because the trees are dead. They're dropping. Some of the trees look like it's winter, but they're not going to come back to life in spring. They're dead. North America, California's just had its biggest bushfire. Sweden, they're not even talking about that, but the amount of bushfires there, they're asking for international aid and not getting it because we can't cope anymore. And these fires, because of their frequency and intensity, change the ecology. We're seeing that in Australia now with the frequency of fires. You don't have the time, the natural time, for things to recover. You get another fire, so you change the species constitution to those that are fire tolerant. What is really important here is the last time, about 55 million years ago, that we had 400 parts per million, sea levels were 20 to 30 metres higher. Or half of the Antarctic ice cap, the West Antarctic ice cap had melted, Greenland had melted. But what that means is that, Bangladesh disappears. We're talking about 70 to 80, sorry, we're talking to about 100 million refugees just in Bangladesh. Just think about what's happening at the moment with the Rohingya crisis. Can't cope. With the whole country now moves. The Netherlands will disappear. You only build bunds and walls so high, dikes so high. I don't think they'll be building 100-foot dikes to keep themselves safe. And all they need is one storm to breach it. And Amsterdam's under 100 foot of water. What does that mean? The coastal USA, New York, New Orleans, Miami, London, Manila. Talk about London, 30 million people. New York, 30 million people, refugees. Manila, 30 million people. Bangkok, 30 million. Jakarta, 30 million. Shanghai, 30 million. And, of course, Melbourne, you might have a couple of little hills as little islands. We put plaques saying this is where Melbourne once existed, but that will be the, what will happen to Melbourne and to Brisbane and to Perth, and so on. But, what's happened is scientists have completely underestimated this rate of sea level change and the rate of warming. Scientists at the moment are in a state of shock with what is happening in the Northern Hemisphere. They had never expected that would happen until the end of the century, not now. And what, last month they were saying that they're looking at 1 billion refugees by 2050. We can't cope with a few million now. What sort of world are we looking at for our children and grandchildren? What I want to say here, we have to adopt renewable energy. That is non-negotiable. That is really important. And what I really liked about what you're doing at Hepburn, we can't wait for governments. Governments will continue to argue. All governments will have Donald Trumps and Tony Abbotts and so on. We can't let them do it anymore. We need to, we act. Governments follow, we lead. And this is what I really like about community empowerment and co-ops. We don't need to wait for governments. We can do it now. And, and for me, what I saw that you guys are doing at Hepburn Shire is just absolutely brilliant. That's the model. We go to renewables, but we have to do more. We have to draw down the CO2. We've got to get below 400 parts per million. And so how do we do it? And that's a real issue. And what I want to put here is that the soil is the greatest carbon sink after the oceans. The oceans are the biggest sink, but we already have too much in. And where I live, I live in Daintree, north of Cairns, we have the Great Barrier Reef, and that is in serious trouble. One, because of the heat of climate change, but also the acidity already is starting to affect it. We can't put any more CO2 into the oceans, into the atmosphere, but we can put it into the soil. And the soil actually holds around 3 times the amount of CO2 as all the CO2 in the atmosphere and all the trees, forests together. It's a massive source. So, what I want to talk about too is, there is good news here. That process has already started. For me, this is actually the most important thing that came out of Paris. And I'm actually one of the physical signatories of this document. And believe it or not, so is Australia. Greg Hunt signed it. I was with him when he signed it. Yeah, I know.
Had his arm behind his back, did you?
Yeah. No, actually, the truth is, I know enough of Greg that he signed it with all best of intentions, but he's one voice, one lone voice, So there's all the other people who straight away go, oh, you've signed it, but we'll just ignore it, forget about it, pretend we didn't do this. But essentially, look, what this project is put up by the French Minister of Agriculture, and it's actually officially part of the Paris Agreement. It's a formal part of it. It is recognised by the United Nations United Nations Climate Change, and there's actually now 34 countries, the main United Nations Food and Agriculture, IFAD, Global Environment Fund, the CGIAR, which is the main United Nations agricultural research units, the World Bank. I should have put them. They're in it now. I was actually in a forum with the World Bank in Washington, DC last month. They were right behind it. And hundreds of NGOs are behind this as well. And so this is a major initiative to change agriculture from one which is a major emitter, depending on how you draw the boundaries, between 30 to 50% of greenhouse gases, become a major mitigator or a major solution by taking, by essentially using photosynthesis to take carbon dioxide out of the air and put it into the soil. And I haven't got time to go into that today, but what I'd just like to give you a couple of numbers and show you that this is doable, this is shovel ready, that we do not need to invent any more technology We just need to scale this up. So we need to draw around 15.5, let's say 16 gigatons of CO2 a year to basically stop the increase. In other words, if the combination of renewables and stopping the increase, we can now start pulling it out, going in a negative. So, to give you some examples, I don't need to go into the maths and stuff here, but I just want to show you 3 examples of what we call good practice organic that's in the literature. And they are sequestering about 3.5 tonnes of CO2 per year per hectare into the soil. And if we extrapolate that by the United Nations Food and Agriculture figures for agricultural lands, just scaling up to good practice organic, we could do 17 gigatons. That's a gigaton over what we need to do. I'll open up for questions later. But what I want to say, that's good practice. We have better practice where we start using compost. We can put that up to 8.2 tonnes, which is 40 gigatons. I was in Gippsland last month. We were there, and one of the places we went to, they're trialling a new machine, a new way of doing cover crops. And he's actually getting paid carbon credits now from the federal government, the first documented case of getting carbon credits for soil carbon, and it's documented 11.7 tonnes of CO2 per hectare per year. That's happening now here in Victoria, in Gippsland. And if we scaled that, what he's doing, that's 60 gigatons. One of my favourites is by Dr. David Johnson from New Mexico, and that, with his system of a highly aerated compost, they're getting something like just under 40 metric tonnes. If we scaled that up, that's 184 gigatons. And I know of other ones that are in development at the moment. What I'm trying to say is that now that people are getting their head around doing this, we're starting to see a whole lot of these technologies. The other really important one is regenerative grazing or holistic grazing. There's different forms. And the data we've got is that the right grazing methods can store carbon faster than any other method. And this is an example of one where they've regenerated very arid lands in Arizona. I wanted to use that because that's very applicable to a lot of Australia. And if we scaled up, if we extrapolated what they did by the world's grasslands, that's just under 100 gigatons a year with grazing. So what I wanted to show here is just, in the case of just 2 of these systems, the beam and the regenerative grazing, if we just managed to scale up to 10% of agriculture with those, that's really achievable. We could sequester enough, it's almost double of what we need, and we could actually turn back climate change within 2 decades. It's doable. I'm going to wait for governments, but once again, we as people will do this and are doing it and are scaling up. And it's one of the things that we're very active around the world. The next part of my presentation I want to talk about, which is also, I regard, is an existential issue. Probably one of the most silent, but one of the most important. And that is, at the moment, we have an epidemic. That's the word, a global epidemic of non-communicable, chronic diseases, World Health Organization. And these things like heart disease, stroke, cancer, respiratory, diabetes, and so on, are the leading cause of mortality in the world. And it's an invisible epidemic. And it's growing, and of course, this burden is greatest on the people, the lowest socio-economic means. They have the least resources, especially in most countries in the world where they're not blessed with a medical system like we have. We are amongst the most fortunate on the planet. These diseases, you can't get from sitting next to somebody here or in a bus. You know, you don't get cancer by sitting next to someone, or diabetes by sitting next to someone. These are environmental or lifestyle diseases, which means they're preventable. We just got to either change the lifestyle or get rid of the environmental factors, the negative environmental factors that are causing them. You know, it's a very simple thing. Once again, we actually have very good information on what's causing them. We can change this tomorrow. Of course, waiting for governments to do it won't happen. That's why we need to educate people. And one of the main ones are pesticides and chemicals, and particularly in our food. And what I want to get across here is get rid of one of the major myths about pesticides, is that pesticides are scientifically tested and are safe. Now, and what surprised me when I was researching this is that the pesticides that are used by farmers are a formulation. They can nominate one part of that formulation. It's usually less than 1%. They call it the active ingredient, and that gets some testing, and I can tell you that testing is completely inadequate. I haven't got time to go into that today. But the formulation has things like solvents, which are highly, most solvents, petrochemicals, are carcinogens. Most of them are highly toxic, surfactants, and a whole range of other ingredients put in it to make it work more effectively. In other words, to make it more toxic. And yet, the regulators make the assumption that for some reason this mixture is not going to be more toxic than the one ingredient that is nominated. Now that is a scientific nonsense. There is some testing for what we call acute toxicity. In other words, how much you need to take to die within 2 weeks of exposure. But that tells you absolutely nothing about long-term diseases like cancer. Cancer usually takes more than 2 weeks. Diabetes, heart disease, liver disease, you can go on and on. The chronic diseases that we have the epidemic of, they all take longer than 2 weeks. So the truth is, there's zero. We have 7,200 registered pesticides in Australia. The United States is only at 1,400. We actually have one of the worst pesticide regulatory systems in the world. The only country I can see that is worse is India. Indonesia is better than us, way above us in terms of what they banned and what they regulate. This mythology of clean and green, does a disservice to the word mythology. So, there's no testing for children's health, reproductive effects, birth defects, cancer, developmental neurotoxicity, endocrine disruption, metabolic disruption, epigenetic mutations, and so on and so on. And I haven't got time to go into detail, but what I want to show you is this. There is only one published study in the scientific literature that looks at what we call environmentally relevant lifetime exposure to a pesticide. In other words, what is the amount that most of us will have in our blood, in our system, over our lifetime. What is the effect? Only one study, and that's by Professor Seralini. And as you can imagine, Monsanto wanted this study killed because the product they used was Roundup. It's, so safe you can only drink, you can drink it, Roundup, that lovely chemical. And what they found were mammary and other tumours, liver damage, kidney damage by small amounts. And when I'm talking about small amounts, I'm talking in parts per billion. Parts per billion, not parts per million. Really small amounts, where they've actually looked at the damage to the tissue. They can see clear, that's not working, but they can see clear damage, lesions, these are scars, or physical damage done to kidneys, livers. They actually looked at Roundup, a Roundup Ready GMO, and control. they wanted to understand, is it Roundup, is it the GMO, or, the combination of the both. They actually found that Roundup on its own, the GMO on its own, and the combination all increased these diseases. All the female rats, except for one, this is in the treated rats, except for one who had ovarian cancer, they all had memory tumours. Memory tumours is a nice way of saying breast cancer. All, most of them had damage to livers and kidneys compared to the controls. And I think this is really important because what we're talking about is these really, really small doses that all of us have in our systems and we're exposed to. And this is particularly the case with children. They are the most vulnerable. In many cases, we've done our damage, but we should be looking at protecting our next generation, preventing that. What sort of society poisons its children? Well, we do. And so what we know is that the smallest amounts of pesticides in the developing fetus and developing children, when I'm talking about developing children, I'm talking up to, including puberty. These are all critical development stages from the fetus, the newborn being breastfed, through to puberty. And we find that the smallest amounts of pesticides have lower IQs, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, autism spectrum. All of these are on the rise. Organ damage, autoimmune diseases, lack of physical coordination, loss of temper, the bipolar, schizophrenia spectrum, depression, which is also leads to child and youth suicide, childhood obesity, and we have very good studies in the scientific literature showing these links to the smallest amount. I just want to look at something like autism, which is just increasing at a phenomenal rate at the moment. And this is a study, I'm one of the co-authors of this study. It was a peer-reviewed study we did. And we looked at a whole range of diseases in the United States that were really increasing rapidly. And we track that against the increase in the use of glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup. Because the rate of Roundup has increased dramatically because of the introduction of Roundup-ready GMO crops. And what we found is over 20 of the diseases they tracked really neatly. And we did what's called a Pearson's correlation coefficient. This is what you look to see the statistical likelihood that these are linked. Because correlation doesn't always equal, it doesn't equal causation. Mobile phone sales in Finland could just track just as neatly as this. So, this is a very good tool. And we chose over 20 diseases where this relationship was 1 in 10,000 that they were not linked. 1 chance in 10,000. That's a pretty high probability that they're linked. We were, of course, attacked by Monsanto and others for daring to, say that their safe product could possibly cause these. We did actually present very good peer-reviewed evidence of biochemical pathways. For instance, the year after we published that, a very good study comes out to show exactly why Roundup, or glyphosate, the active ingredient Roundup, causes these. And if you have a look here, this is the development in nerve cells from very, very small amounts. I'll go this way so I'm not out of the camera. I'm okay. So just start again. What is shown here is very small amounts of glyphosate, what it does to the normal development of nerve cells. Here's the control, no Roundup. And if you have a look here, the glyphosate one, it's not developing properly. The nerve continues to develop, and the glyphosate one, now look at that, it's underdeveloped. And then you can see, as it matures, it's underdeveloped. Now, these sort of events last a lifetime. And what I want to say here is where this is really important is that our biggest collection of nerve cells is here. And so these small amounts of glyphosate crossing the placenta, which it does, going through breast milk as it does, being fed to them as they are growing, is stopping the normal development of the brain. And, you know, I think what's really important is this. It is not reversible. The only good thing that, you know, that we can say about this is that we know about neuroplasticity now. While that damage is not reversible, we know we can build new neurons. If we stop the exposure and start looking at ways of you know, getting children to develop new neurons, they can go on to have a reasonable life. But the first thing we have to do is stop the exposure. The other one is cancer, which is an epidemic around the world, and particularly children's cancers. And I think one of the things I want to get across, which is really important to me, was the United States President's Cancer Panel. It's over 30 of the world's best cancer specialists, best oncologists, wrote a report for Barack Obama. It was published in 2010 and of course went nowhere. But this is a really good meta-study looking at the causes of cancer. And what they said is 80% of cancers are caused by environmental toxins. Yes, you might have genes that predispose yourself to cancer, but not everyone with those genes gets it. We're starting to understand with epigenetics how these small amounts of chemicals can actually affect the gene. Best way to say is turn it on to express it so it now will make cancer. We also know we can do the opposite through a good lifestyle and turn it off so you won't get cancer. That's the beautiful thing about this. Now that we know that this is environmental, we can control our environment and we could prevent 80% of cancers. Think about that as a public health outcome, a public good. If we could prevent 80% of cancers, you know, the amount of people who are dying needlessly because of it, you know, what other health initiative could do that? And yet we know enough that we can. Governments won't act. Then we could use the funding for the other 20%, make cancer history. So what we're seeing now is this increase in cancer rates in children. World Health Organization again, you know, showing, this is last year, you know, a 13% increase in children. And this is once again the study we did with Roundup and also with GMOs. I just want to show you the relationship, in this case, between Roundup and a couple of cancers, how well they track. And like I said, the odds of these not being linked is 10,000 to 1. After we published this, the World Health Organization came out with classifying glyphosate as the 2A, which is the second highest level for a carcinogen. What that means is that animal studies show that this definitely causes cancer. When it is 1A, we need a lot of studies showing that it's causing cancer in people. That's difficult to get because it's not usually very good to feed people something and see if they get cancer. So it's only about 100 you know, compounds have got group 1. But 2A, let's put it this way, we're an animal. If it causes cancer in animals, it causes cancer in us. What did come through, which was really clear, is this. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, definitely linked to that. And of course, a few hours ago, this happened, which, you know, there's been court, this is the first of the court cases, but there are thousands of them now where people are suing Monsanto over glyphosate. And a few hours ago, it was still Friday after, or when I got up in the morning, I should say, it was still Friday afternoon in the USA, and the verdict came through. I'm lucky because I actually know people directly involved in it, so I had it as soon as I woke up. So I just thought I'd let you know. 289 US dollars is awarded, which is about over 400 million Australian, closer to 500 million these days. So, right, you know, they'll appeal, but they'll lose it because the judge, in this case, basically disallowed something like 90% of the information on how Monsanto has corrupted science and how they kept it hidden. If they appeal, that will come out in the appeal, which so, but they're stupid enough, they will appeal. But the floodgates are open now. But that's a floodgate for all council schools in Australia as well now. Be warned. The World Health Organization has said this is a carcinogen, and the first test case now proves it. So the last thing I want to end on is this, with children, is that we also know that many of these pesticides are nerve poisons, like organophosphates were developed by the Nazis before World War II. We actually don't know if the Nazis ever used them, but we know Saddam Hussein and that nice gentleman Assad in Syria and others like to use them against their own people. But it's the same chemistry. And also that Novichok, which is used in the UK against the Russian spies, is also the same chemistry. And this is in our food. What I'd like to say here, what is, oh sorry, that's organophosphates, but you know, when I talk about pyrethroids, when I talk about carbonates, nicotinoids, I can go on, they all work as nerve poisons in different ways. The children and the newborn, the unborn and the newborn, they do not have the enzymes in their liver that we have as adults to detoxify these chemicals. So the truth is no amount is safe. And what this particular study looked at, in this case, one of the organophosphates, and found that in the embryo there is no level that they can deal with. The smallest level will cause problems. This is another very good example of this between two communities in Mexico, in Sonora. One community lives in lives in the valley where pesticides are used. It's a farming community, so they're getting exposed to spray drift, as most of us who live in rural communities do. And the other group lived up in the mountains on the top, where there was only traditional agriculture, there's no pesticides used. And these are 4-year-old girls. And if we look here, this is what we'd expect 4-year-old girls to draw. Lovely, you know, drawings that any of us as parents would be really proud of. Look at this. These poor girls cannot draw anything that remotely looks like a person. That's brain damage. And of course, this was dismissed once again. Oh yeah, that's you know, that's not real science. That's, you know, whatever, you know, forget about it. However, since then, 4 other studies came out, and there's a lot more from that. And what they basically found is that fetal exposure to small amounts, in this case organophosphates, but we know with pretty well all pesticides, that it leads to reductions in IQs. I'm just using this, but there are plenty more issues. What was really important to come is one of the studies tried to find the lowest amount. Oh look, is there a threshold? Because that's what we're always told by the regulators. Look, we go down, we find a threshold once, and then we go below that, and it's safe, you know. They couldn't find a threshold. So no level is safe. I think what's really important here too is that most people get exposure from food, not from gardening, or not, you know, most people now aren't farmers. The vast majority of people get their pesticide exposure from food, and every one of us here will have pesticides, multiple pesticides in our system. And I want to end on this, because this to me just says everything. This is looking at the brain development of young children, and in the case looking at their mother's diet, and this exposure has come from their mother thinking they're eating healthy fruit and vegetables, but there's pesticides, they've crossed the placenta, and what has happened is that they can actually see physical damage on the brain. A lot of this sort of science couldn't be done before because the way you did it is like the slides I showed you before. You feed the animal, then you kill them, then you cut them up, the bits and pieces, and look at them under a microscope and compare the two groups. As much as some researchers would like to do that, it's ethically not good to do that with children. So, but now we've got non-invasive, non-destructive techniques like MRI scans, and this says everything. So, I really want to end on this because we're facing two futures. One, I really believe both of these are existential threats. Like, what sort of society does this to their children when we have the science to actually know the damage now that we're doing? We can't no longer say we're ignorant. The Romans lined their drinking vessels and everything with lead, and that caused major problems for their civilization, particularly their ruling class, were the ones who could afford the lead. The Chinese gave their emperors immortality pills made of mercury. Though they worked, their bodies stayed embalmed and didn't decay because mercury is a good preservative. Yeah, the rest of it wasn't so good, but that was ignorance. They didn't know they're poisons. We know these things are poisons. We're using them because they are poisonous. And look what we're doing. And so I just want to end here that we actually have a choice. With two existential threats here: climate change and the health of our children. And what I want to say is what we're doing with regenerative organic agriculture, regenerative agriculture, is that we can make a difference. We can actually beat both of them very, very simply by changing the way we farm. And to me, that's a really powerful message and something I want to get across. And once again, I want to say too, is something that we can take control of. So people ask, well, how can we do it? Well, the most wonderful thing is actually come to a place like here and support buying organic food. Just that alone is an incredibly strong political statement. We as people can vote with our wallets and make a difference. Instead of giving that money to Woolworths and to big corporations, start supporting our local co-ops, set up our own co-ops. In other words, what we need is what we're calling is a regeneration revolution. As we as people empower ourselves and take control, and we can turn it around. Because if we wait for politicians, it's not going to happen. Thank you.